The fields upon which the American Civil War's bloodiest battle occurred now host the largest collection of outdoor artwork in the United States. At least 1,320 monuments and markers dot the landscape, some of which were installed with funds from the very men who fought this battle. But from the dedication of the very first monument, placement has always been contentious. None have been more fiercely disputed than the monuments to states that contributed soldiers to the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. I've already given my tipsy opinions on these monuments in a tier list, but while drinking and putting images on brackets is fun, it may not be the most formative experience. Therefore, in this edition of Retracing History, we'll be trampling through the mud during a deluge to document the story behind each Confederate state monument at Gettysburg. As the United States neared the turn of the 20th century, scores of Union monuments had risen across Gettysburg. In contrast, only one Confederate regimental monument had succeeded in being erected, and even that was with contention. There are multiple factors as to the lack of Confederate monuments up to this point. For one, the Battle of Gettysburg was a Union victory in a Union state. To many veterans on both sides, it did not make sense to establish an elegant marker for the losing side in this military engagement. For those that did wish to erect a monument, there were only two avenues to finance: lobby for legislation or privately raise the necessary funds. While Union state legislatures could rely on public zeal in commemorating a victory at Gettysburg, veteran organizations still struggled in getting regimental monuments. Considering former Confederate states were economically wrecked because of the war, establishing a monument of any degree was not realistic throughout the 19th century. But what about a monument to an individual? One figure that had been perceived by many in the South to be the best leader of the war. Of course, I'm talking about Robert E. Lee. But I'm surprised to discover the first major push for a Lee statue at Gettysburg was not from Virginia. In fact, it wasn't from any former Confederate state. The first major effort a state made to fund a statue of Lee was in fact Pennsylvania. In 1903, State Representative Thomas Cooper introduced a bill that would allocate $20,000 to a monument of the Confederate general. To make things even more curious, Cooper was a Union veteran who had fought at Gettysburg. The mindset was the contrast of existing monuments between Cemetery Ridge and Seminary Ridge was giving the visitors to the battlefield a biased interpretation. Many opposed the bill, citing that the War Department were installing a variety of tablets that would denote the brigades, divisions, and corps of both armies. There was no need for a Lee statue. Though this first effort was quickly dashed, it did commence discussions over establishing some variant of a Confederate monument. Some saw it as a belated step toward reconciliation. Others perceived it as a chance for Southern states to distinguish themselves once more from their Northern counterparts. Both motives led to the state of Virginia passing a bill in 1908 to erect a Virginia state monument at Gettysburg. The committee hired Frederick William Sivers, an Indiana sculptor who had moved to Richmond to continue his study of art. Sivers sought out to make the most lifelike statue of individuals on a battlefield yet, studying Lee's death mask and his horse's skeleton to satisfy these ambitions. Sivers' design would also prominently feature 7 soldiers. Each was to represent a different trade of the 19,000 Virginians that fought at Gettysburg. This consisted of a professional man, a mechanic, an artist, a boy, a businessman, a farmer, and a youth. From the announcement that Lee was to be immortalized in bronze at the scene of his most famous battle, conflict arose. Virginia wished for the monument to be placed at the angle where one of the brief breakthroughs into the Union line occurred during Pickett's charge, which was flatly refused. Then came inscribing the monument, with Sivers originally using phrases of heroic achievements, immortal fame, and glorious cause in describing the soldiers of Virginia. The War Department deemed the phrases violating long-established guidelines calling for neutral text on battlefield markers. There was even a dispute over what flag would be emblazoned on the monument, with the War Department pushing for Virginia's state flag be used rather than the Army of Northern Virginia battle flag. The clashes over design choices, as well as acquiring all the necessary funds and material, led to multiple delays. The base was laid in 1913 on Seminary Ridge, believed to be in the approximate location Lee had observed Pickett's charge, but would not be until June of 1917 that Lee's statue and the 7 soldiers were formally dedicated. A throng of veterans and civilians gathered at the pedestal for the commemorative ceremony. While the monument was created with the stated intention of reconciliation, most of the speeches hailed the efforts of Virginia as serving a righteous cause. It's safe to say Union veteran groups like the Grand Army of the Republic were none too enthused. The erection of the Virginia State Monument spurred other governments and veteran entities in former Confederate states to begin their own efforts to mark the battlefield. But as Civil War veterans died off and the Great Depression began to grip the country, only 2 state Confederate monuments were dedicated by the time of the Second World War. The state of North Carolina monument was financed by the state legislature, but also a chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. North Carolina holds the distinction of suffering the highest numerical casualties per Confederate state at the battle, at over 6,000 individuals. Gutzon Borglum was hired to create the monument. He was infamous at the time for having been hired to design a massive stone engraving of Confederate generals on Stone Mountain, Georgia, but ran out of town when he did not deliver on his promises. Borglum sculpted the monument in only a few months, but in that short time was able to pose Confederate veterans to create his final design, which was dedicated in 1929. Following this, Borglum would return to work in South Dakota on what would become his most famous project, Mount Rushmore. With support from a chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, Alabama would succeed in erecting a monument to its 6,000 soldiers in 1931. The figure of the woman is to represent the spirit of the Confederacy motioning a soldier to continue the fight, complete with a crest depicting the St. Andrew's Cross, the basis of the Army of Northern Virginia battle flag. The granite was partly quarried from the Gettysburg area, as well as Vermont. Other southern state governments were quick to propose ideas. None would make headway until the 1960s. The time was ripe for renewed commemoration, in part to coincide with the centennial of the Civil War. But cultural turmoil was heating up in the United States because of the Cold War and civil rights movements, which made Gettysburg a bully pulpit for politicians trying to unify their respective states for or against federal policies of the time. Throughout the decade, 5 Confederate state monuments were erected, with plans for more pressed into motion. A blue granite marker was dedicated in September of 1961 in honor of the 13,000 Georgian soldiers that made up the Army of Northern Virginia. It was established at the approximate location of General Paul Semmes's brigade of Georgians, which stepped off for their attack on the Wheatfield July 2, 1863. An identical monument was erected on the Antietam battlefield at the same time. For the 100th anniversary of the battle, 2 new Confederate state monuments were erected along Seminary Ridge. Both were created by sculptor J.D. Hill, each granite in design. The South Carolina State Monument was dedicated on July 2, 1963, and lists all the regiments from the Palmetto State, complete with engravings of the tree. One of the speakers for the dedication was Alabama Governor George Wallace, the infamous segregationist. During his speech, he called for all Southerners to rally and fight to restore their constitutional rights as separate states and individuals. The next day, the dedication ceremony of the Florida State Monument was held a few hundred yards up West Confederate Avenue. Florida had only 3 regiments at the battle, but it suffered over 60% casualties. Congressman Sam Gibbons was one of the speakers, who used his time to call for Americans to set aside racial divide and unify against communism. The state of Texas would erect a marker of red granite the following year, close to an early United Daughters of the Confederacy obelisk. It is one of 11 identical Texas monuments placed on battlefields across the country. Like Florida, the representation of Texas in the Army of Northern Virginia came in the form of a lone brigade, but was known as one of the toughest brigades from either side. However, one of the Texas Brigade's regiment was not even from Texas. The 3rd Arkansas Infantry was the only regiment from the natural state to fight in the Eastern Theater. Nevertheless, the state of Arkansas contributed the funds necessary to erect their own state monument at the Gettysburg battlefield in 1966. In addition to a granite engraving of Arkansas soldiers, the monument features blocks from the Army of Northern Virginia battle flag, reportedly to represent the aluminum industry of the state. In the early 1970s, two Confederate state monuments created by Donald DeLue were dedicated on the southern tip of Seminary Ridge. These were dedicated to the soldiers from Louisiana and Mississippi, dedicated in 1971 and 73, respectively. Unlike the monuments of the Centennial, DeLue's contributions to the battlefield had larger-than-life depictions. Feet and muscle of unrealistic proportions are found on the figures. Both prominently feature the Army of Northern Virginia battle flag, but in different circumstances. The Louisiana monument places emphasis on the artillerymen from the Pelican State, with a dying gunner clasping the flag to his chest, while the patron saint of artillerists, St. Helena, hovers above. Beneath St. Helena are two laurels, signifying the North and South, with a dove of peace perched between the two. The Mississippi monument depicts a much less mythical image, referencing William Barksdale's assault on the peach orchard, immortalized in Italian green bronze as a Mississippian soldier defending a fallen flag bearer. It is interesting to note that DeLue's contributions are located on property that once was the farm of James Warfield. Mr. Warfield was a free man that moved to Gettysburg at the start of the Civil War, moving from the slave state of Maryland in the hopes he can keep his wife and 6 children safe. When word spread that Confederate forces were nearing town, Warfield evacuated. His farm became the jumping-off point for portions of Confederate assaults on the Union left flank at the Peach Orchard and the Little Round Top. When Warfield returned after the battle, he reported 138 graves on his property. Much of his furniture had been destroyed, and all his crops ruined. He was forced to relocate to Cashtown, not suspecting the farm could be made viable. Fortunately, his decision to lease the property rather than sell it allowed him to build assets greater than he possessed before the battle. In the summer of 2020, the National Park Service restored the Warfield farmhouse to its 1863 appearance. The state of Tennessee had officially put plans in motion to construct their own monument as early as 1968. Unlike other states, Tennessee would finance their monument with only private funding. The original artist tasked with rendering the design was Felix de Weldon, the sculptor behind the Marine Corps War Memorial in Washington, D.C., but his plans were far too costly. Fundraising languished, only achieving about $50,000 a decade later. A simplified version of Weldon's original plan, featuring 3 soldiers representing the Tennessee regiments in the Confederate Army, were engraved on a piece of granite from South Dakota. The base of the monument is in the likeness of the volunteer state's outline. The 8-foot height, 16-foot length, and 5-foot width were chosen because they equal 29, the number of states collectively represented in the fighting at Gettysburg. The monument was dedicated in a downpour on July 3, 1982, although hundreds endured the weather for the services. In addition to these Confederate state monuments, a Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Memorial was designed by DeLue and dedicated during the battle's centennial. In 1994, a unified Maryland state monument was erected in Ziegler's Grove, featuring a Union and Confederate soldier assisting each other off the battlefield. A small number of Confederate regimental monuments have since been dedicated. During our exploration of Seminary Ridge, we came across the 11th Mississippi Monument, which was dedicated in 2000. The regiment was outfitted in part by the University Greys, a company of students from the University of Mississippi. The 11th Mississippi endured some of the heaviest losses, not just at Gettysburg, but during any single action of the war, enduring a casualty rate of 87% by the end of Pickett's charge. Amongst those involved was Color Sergeant William O'Brien, who was the first of 8 regimental flag bearers to fall during that infamous assault. O'Brien is immortalized in as accurate of a depiction that can be made out of bronze, complete with accoutrements slung around his body and battle flag tightly clasped in hand. There is one final monument I wish to address. So I'm in front of the James Longstreet Monument here on West Confederate Avenue. This was not dedicated until 1998. It was a long road for General Longstreet, Lee's old warhorse, to get recognition in bronze. Longstreet was critical of Lee. Most famous, it's been made very famous in recent memory by The Killer Angels by Michael Shara, which was adapted into the movie Gettysburg, and Longstreet is one of, if not the most prominent figure of the movie, where he is critical of Pickett's charge, or what should be more properly called Longstreet's assault, as he had overall command of the assault, even though he won no involvement. Famously, he did not even voice the order to assault. He simply nodded to General Pickett to begin the advance. After the war, Longstreet wanted to be reconciliatorial. He really wanted to be done with the conflict. And at one point in 1874, when there was a riot involving a white national group in Louisiana, Longstreet was sent down to raise a small force. Don't know too much if it was a militia or official United States servicemen, but he raised a small little army to try to end the rioting. This became known as the Battle of Liberty Place, and a result of which, I believe Longstreet was actually minorly wounded, but he succeeded in quelling the riots. And for all these reasons, Longstreet essentially got blacklisted from a lot of Southern histories of the American Civil War. Now, he was welcomed in 1888 to Gettysburg. He was arguably the big attraction for the 1888 reunion here, and he had a private dinner with our favorite, me and Connor's favorite, Dan the Man Sickles. Boy, I want to know what was said at that dinner. So, Longstreet lived two lives in history. Southern history did not remember him, did not like that he criticized Lee. Northern histories are a little more fond of Longstreet, but ultimately his name was not really talked about until, as I mentioned, The Killer Angels came out, the movie Gettysburg. And in 1998, this monument was dedicated. It's actually sculpted by Gary Castile, who has a studio here to this day in Gettysburg. Mr. Castile has worked on a variety of monuments, not just here, but on other Civil War battlefields. And what he wanted to do was have a contrast to the Virginia monument, where Lee's on this towering podium. Longstreet here is eye level with the public. Now, this has caused criticism. It's not necessarily a glamorous monument. It's not much to catch your eye. In fact, you'll notice it's covered in the trees, so if it's later in the summer, you won't even be able to see the monument from the road. But that's to humanize Longstreet. And initially they wanted to have a Longstreet memorial here in 1941, but as you can imagine, there was a certain other event that occurred. There's something in the place called Hawaii, right, Connor?
Yeah, I think so. There was I think it was a luau, wasn't it?
Something like that.
Yeah.
So the original monument did not get put together, but this one was, and Longstreet's surviving granddaughter was here for the dedication. By retracing the erection of the Confederate state monuments at Gettysburg, I hope you noticed the trends I discovered. The design of the monuments changed and occurred in distinct spans of time. The original three were the only ones erected at a time veterans may have had a direct impact on that project, with soldiers and commanders bathed in glory in stark contrast to the horrors that awaited them on the fields towards Cemetery Hill. The monuments of the 1960s were far more simplistic, produced to be on the field in time for the centennial. Those that followed had more time to marinate in development and were initially fantastical depictions of the battle, before withdrawing to more realistic proportions. I would like to think the shift toward realism and modesty in the more recent monuments is a sign the scars left by the war have at last healed. However, we've all seen a resurgence of division in the country, with monuments like those featured in this presentation becoming a part of this fighting. I can only hope we are not doomed to repeat the mistakes of our past. Well, if you reached this point in the video, you should hit the like button, because you had to endure seeing this ugly grill. But, for all seriousness, just want to leave a few extra notes before we wrap up this edition. This was the 50th episode of Retracing History, so we've made that milestone. Now, when I started doing the Retracing History series, it was actually going to be a trilogy of videos about local railroads. I didn't envision it to become this full-on, history travel vlog series, but as I started noticing a trend in what my videos were about, I decided to label them all Retracing History. Now, At the time of recording, it's the end of August, start of September 2023, and I am going back to college for another semester. I have 2 more semesters before I graduate with a history degree. In that intermediate time, I have to devote most of my attention to getting that degree, and you're going to notice a dip in the upload rate on the channel. So I'm not going away anytime soon. Yours will not likely be weekly uploads through September, October, and November of 2023. But don't worry, I got a bunch of projects planned, some more Retracing history videos in the works. So if you want to be notified when one of those projects comes out, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you want to go the extra mile in support of me, you can buy me a cup of coffee. The link is in the description below. Hey, thank you for supporting me. If you've been supporting me for the past few days, past few months, past few years, or if this is the first time supporting me, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.